Welcome to the last session of the 2022 OAIA Conference. I'm thrilled to be here with you to facilitate this session. If we haven't met before, my name is Catherine Gentile, and I'm a Senior Environmental Planner and Team Lead with WSP Canada. And just super thrilled to be here. I've always loved coming to these conferences, and so really nice to be behind the mic here this time. So we have a really exciting session for you. There's been a theme of engagement coming up all today. I wasn't here yesterday, but I'm sure it came up as well. So we're going to continue that with Chris and John from Stantec, giving us a bit of an overview on Indigenous community integration into their Marathon Palladium project. And then we're going to move on to Simon, who's going to speak a little bit about mediation and impact assessment. So without further ado, Chris is going to lead us off.
Thanks, Catherine. Glad to be here today. We were able to attend yesterday and hear a lot of the good conversations, and that conversations continued today, and a lot of good topics have been covered up, or have been covered. We hope to kind of talk through sort of a case study on how a lot of the things we've been talking about have been or can be implemented in a project scenario, and some of the benefits around that. So my name's Chris Powell. I'm a Senior Environmental Planner with Stantec. I work out of the Waterloo office. My colleague John Pounder is here as well. He's an Environmental Planner at Waterloo as well. We were both part of a team that was retained by Generation PGM to undertake an update to an environmental impact study for a project up in Marathon. The Generation PGM had taken over from another company and restarted a process that's been restarted. So we were responsible for coordinating the environmental impact statement and a number of the technical studies as part of a larger group. Like I said, Ecometrics, Northern Bioscience, Knight Piezold, and Wood WSP all played a function as part of a larger team retained by the proponent to do that impact assessment and to carry it through a joint review panel process. So today we're going to provide an overview of the project and the process that we went through, as well as an overview of the Indigenous communities that were involved in the project, and touch on some of the why those groups, those communities were engaged, why engagement with those communities is important, as we've heard today, and some examples about how they were engaged during the process. And then next, we'll run through kind of a review of some of the key outcomes of that process of engagement, including how those communities were integrated into the process and several of the benefits that resulted, as well as review some of the implications of what that might mean for EA practice in Canada moving forward. So just a quick overview of the project. It's a proposed open pit palladium and copper mine. It's proposed near the town of Marathon along the north shore of Lake Superior, generally between Highway 17 and the Pick River. And Pick River flows southward on the east side of the mine site, and is located upstream of Biktigong Nishnabeg, First Nation community who was actively involved in the project, and just upstream as well from the Puxsa National Park. Contains all the standard components of a mine. It's 3 open pits. There's a process management facility, water management treatment, water collection system, roads, transmission lines, all the typical components of a mine, that it's part of the design and assess the effects of it, was part of our job. We're not here today to talk about the specifics of that, but rather about the process and the consultation and engagement that took place. So due to the proposed rate of extraction, the project was subject to a federal EA process. The client, or sorry, the proponent also voluntarily undertook a provincial EA, and that the project itself was taken through a joint review panel process that John will now discuss.
Down. Oh, I just turned it off. Sorry, I'm a lot taller than Chris is apparently. Just bear with me for a second. Yeah, so as Chris alluded to, it was a unique opportunity because it went through a joint review panel process. So it was looked at under SIA 2012. It wasn't looked at under the new IA Act, as well as the Ontario EA Act. And the other sort of unique part of this project, as Chris alluded to, is that there was a stall period. The project was put on hold by the previous proponent. So there was an opportunity that initial EIA was actually prepared and sufficiency was declared by the agency back in 2014, and then the proponent at the time decided to put the project on hold. And so I'll get back to sort of a benefit that came out of that in a bit, but it is a little bit important to the context. This isn't something that's happened fairly quickly. This has been a almost 20-year process from the start of the time when they started some of the baseline work to where we sit today, and it's really not done. It's a process that also had an important role from the Crown. The Crown formed a Crown Consultation Committee, or team, which I'll refer to as CCT. Like many of you in the rooms, I just like lots of acronyms, and it's just comes out by nature. But that CCT was formed of members of both the provincial and federal government, and they had their own mandate that was similar to where we were in the joint review panel process, but a little bit separate. So they coordinated their own consultation on behalf of the Crown. So they were actively involved with the communities, around engaging them and going through efforts to sort of document their comments, concerns, and interests in the project. And then they're working in a, I'm looking at the IA folks, but I call it a separate yet combined process. So they fed information into the joint review panel reports and their decision making through their own preparation reports and comments, which looked at factors beyond what the sort of project scoping was. And so where we sit today is that we held a 6-week online hearing, joint review panel hearing earlier this year, and we're fortunate enough in early September, so a couple weeks ago, IAA, the agency, released some draft conditions, which are currently out for public review to Saturday. Yeah, Saturday, that's tomorrow's problem. And so once those sort of draft comments come back, conditions come back in, there'll be a federal and provincial decision-making process. And so moving on for that, let's take a bit back to the context of the site. So you can see the site there is the little star called Site Study Area. And what you'll see there in the yellow is the Robinson Treaty. And sort of the interesting part about this is 16 communities were identified to be engaged, the majority which were in the Robinson Treaty area, 3 of which were Métis. And several of these communities asserted that they were not signatories of the Robinson Treaty and are going through their own processes to deal with that. And at this point, I would like to point out that we do acknowledge, and the proponent did acknowledge that Biktsigan Anishinaabe, who is fairly close in proximity to the project area, asserted exclusive title over the project site. But what that really meant is that there was lots of opportunities for engagement. And so what we did is, sorry, I'm skipping ahead of myself. We looked at sort of some of the reasons as to why we need to engage. So we thought about this in the context of bringing the presentation today. I'm going to skim through this fairly quickly because, to be honest, there's a lot of covered already on this topic. But we'd sort of looked at this from where things used to be. So when this process started and when we went back and did our gap analysis and review of what was done sort of in the 2010 area for what was considered to be consultation, it was a lot of tokenism. It was a lot of just information informing just for the sake of hitting regulatory requirements, and not so much integration into moving beyond that. So when we sort of came on, we thought about it, and there's been a lot of changes. Things like UNDRIP have come along. Many proponents now have their own ESG policies. There's funding on lending requirements that come along with looking at ensuring that projects have environmental and social responsibility tied to them in order to achieve funding and investment. And in addition, specifically with our proponent, they felt that an early and often process, as we've heard throughout this, is integral to achieving a project schedule and preventing delays. And that's something that, as a consultant, we take on for all sorts of things, whether it's engagement with First Nations communities, engagement with regulatory agencies, or the general public. It's important to get that early and often buy-in to the program. And with this project, I'll get to it in a little bit, but it also presented a unique opportunity is that not only was there traditional land use, but there was current and ongoing Indigenous use of the land, specifically in and around our project site by communities. So they, going back to that, have that spiritual knowledge and a much better understanding of what happens in that area, coming from years of experience and the culture being passed down. So that was something that was really sort of flagged to us as people that were brought into the project in 2020-ish as something that was really important to integrate. And the last thing is this early and often Indigenous engagement was really important to look at identifying mutual benefits from this project and ways we can move forward. So we followed the traditional, I'm going to say traditional engagement opportunities, the newspaper ads, the open houses, some sort of novel ideas were brought up forward. The picture there you'll see is a bulletin board that is the old gas station going in and out of Marathon. So anyone going in and out of town to get groceries drives by this. And then COVID hit, and the project team had to think about some different ways. I would say about 2/3 of the communities remained shut off from outsiders for quite a while, and it was a challenge for them to work through that online engagement. Even more challenged by several of the communities did not have reliable internet, and so that presented a challenge through both the engagement as well as the hearing process. But through the entire process, there was offers for ongoing field work, peer review and capacity funding to help review for some of the EA documents, to go through the JRP process to come out. And then as we sort of near the end, which ties Tom maybe to sort of what Paul was saying, is environmental committees reform. So they were established, I don't know what word I was going for, to help sort of as that mechanism of setting up a two-way communication channel between various communities and the proponent as they went through the process. And now they're transitioning to look at some of the ways of developing specific follow-up and monitoring programs so that there can be some engagement and there can be some capacity and collaboration through that process. And lastly, there's capacity funding to either undertake studies. There's extensive traditional knowledge studies that were done, sort of the initial baseline, as well as to help with participation in the hearing process. So where did all this end up? I think a big takeaway for us that we really came forward with was an acknowledgement of the spiritual connection to the land. So water, as we've heard the ladies this morning, was a very important factor for many Indigenous peoples, and was no different here. The Big Tigzibi, or the Pick River, as Chris alluded to, that runs directly down the east side of the site, it was traditionally used as a travel route to the north, connecting to Lake Superior, and there's a extensive traditional land and resource use documented within the area, and that had a direct impact onto the project design. So there was actually a substantial project design that was made early on in the project that completely removed all mine infrastructure elements from an entire watershed, a lake called Bamos Lake, immediately north of the site. That is no easy feat. They essentially took everything but the pits and shifted it to a different location and design. So it was a large rework. Through the EIS addendum process, it was identified that the Pick River, for its spiritual importance, further redesigns for water management were made in order to move all tailings facilities and potential for tailings out of the Pick River watershed. So shifting and aligning components completely on the side. That's why if you go back to an earlier slide, it kind of looks like a butterfly, the site, because they actually moved the tailings facilities away from the Pick River. And that actually got into some other project outcomes as it related to seeking consensus on project closure. So working with the communities, specifically Bictagon in this project, to really seek consensus on what it looked like for closure planning. And Chris will talk a little bit more on the wording seeking consensus, but for now it's really their direct input and direct engagement into that. It also realized several community benefits. There is a CBA for this there's several CBAs, but the large proponent behind one of the CBAs is currently going with Bictagon, and they have a unique situation in which the chief and council have actually taken it forward to the community. So there is currently going through a ratification process, a ratification vote on a CBA. So in essence, that's sort of bringing some of that benefit, and not only bringing that benefit back to the community as indicated by the chief and council, but also bringing it back to the community at large. There is input into the follow-up and monitoring programs and provisions made to help Indigenous communities participate and do some of their own monitoring within the area. There's also employment opportunities that are coming out. So a recent press release that we can talk about, and I should come out and say that the exact contents of the details of the CBA, we as a consultant for Generation PGM, we're not privy to. It's part of their commercial practice, but we can talk about some of the generalities of what came out of that. So one of those being the operation and servicing for the accommodation complex that will service the construction and potentially some of the operational workforce. And it sort of realized a series of project supports and partnerships. And what was really sort of key through those conversations and dialogue was that the communities there were part of the community. Like many northern communities in that area, they're resource dependent. There's a large mining project that was winding down and was having a large impact on the community. And so it was working with the various stakeholders to both realize some of the social and economic benefits that a project like this could be, as well as working to mitigate the environmental effects. And with that said, I'm going to pass it back to Chris to talk about some of the non-project related outcomes.
All right, great, thanks, John. So like John ran through some of the project benefits, and typically when we're talking about environmental assessment, we're looking at focusing on what the effects of the project would be on the environment. But there's also by integrating Indigenous communities into the process, there's opportunities exist to have benefits kind of beyond what the project would otherwise achieve. So in the case of the Marathon Palladium project, the process provided an opportunity for the communities in the area to raise awareness of some of the systemic issues and conditions that they face, such as issues with housing and infrastructure and education and daycare and some of the underfunding that goes into those programs. And that increased awareness was not only considered by the project team in assessing what the effects would be, but it was also communicated with the CCT to kind of convey that information to them and have them work together to understand and have those discussions amongst themselves with the review panel and with other agencies moving forward. Generation also committed funding to, as John alluded to, through the CBA itself, but also to participate in the EA process. And the CCT themselves, in working with the agencies, that identified a number of opportunities to either provide additional funds or speed up those funds getting to the communities for some of the other community-led projects that they're working on. And in the end, the engagement that occurred and the commitments that were made through the process really resulted in a partnership being developed between the proponent and the various communities that were involved, where they were all working kind of towards a common purpose. One of the key outcomes, for sure, coming out of the release of the draft conditions, and this stems from commitments that were made through the hearing process. Generation PGM proposed in coordinating with the community, BN in particular, to seek consensus on a number of different items that they'd be developing over time. And that's been reflected in the draft conditions that have been released, specifically not just engaging with the communities and consulting with the communities on things like follow-up programs, but really seeking consensus from those communities to get their input and buy-in into those follow-up programs. Now, consensus is not consent. Kind of means general agreement. It's not a permission, so it's not quite all the way, to providing ultimate control to the communities on the outcomes, but it's definitely in a kind of an increased level of engagement that's required, and an increased kind of level of partnership that really brings those two sides together to work towards follow-up programs, as well as socioeconomic kind of mitigation measures, and the reclamation plan itself, or the end land use plan, to seek that kind of coordinated buy-in. The consultation obligations still remain, but again, for certain conditions, that requirement to seek a consensus has been added, and we think that's the first time that's happened. We're not aware anyway of other projects where that's been proposed, but we'll see what happens in the final conditions, and hopefully that stays. So kind of to conclude, some of the implications to the EA practice, so what does this all mean, basically? The project and kind of the outcomes as we go through the process, and by no means, the draft conditions have just come out and there's a lot of project left to go, a lot of process left to go, but it potentially establishes a new standard or expectations on the level of engagement and what really can be done when there's partnerships formed between the proponent and the First Nation communities that are directly affected by the project. Although the project was considered under OAIA 2012, this definitely reflects the increased requirements and expectations under the Impact Assessment Act, as we've heard, to consider and more involve First Nation communities within the EA process itself, in all aspects of it. I think as practitioners and on behalf of proponents, it needs to be recognized that this definitely increases complexity of EAs. There's more people involved. There's more emphasis on that, involving other people and considering additional opinions and working through and talking through issues. It's not just a matter of one way or speaking to people. It's really hearing them and understanding what their ideas are and incorporating that into the project. And really, I think at the end of the day, it's a great opportunity. The recognition of the theme of this conference is to create value through the EA process, and by integrating the communities into the EA process and really partnering with them through the process can result in co-benefits, basically, right? The community benefits from the project success, and proponents definitely benefit when the community benefits from the process. Thanks.
That was awesome. I just love that there are proponents that support issues that transcend their project. So really great example that we can all sort of take to heart and hopefully apply. Going going to invite Simon to come next, and he's going to speak again about mediation and impact assessment.
Okay. So hi, everyone. I'm Simon, and I'm a Master's of Planning student at Queen's University. And today I'm going to be sharing some of my preliminary thesis research with you on the use and potential of mediation in impact assessment for addressing issues in conventional IA practice. Nice, it was upside down. So today I'm just going to be giving you a little background on what alternative dispute resolution is, and specifically on the role of mediation in impact assessment. And I'm going to be accomplishing this through sharing 3 case studies with you and applying lessons learned from these studies to outline a preliminary approach to the use of mediation in impact assessment. So alternative dispute resolution, or ADR, is a collection of conflict resolution approaches, which are alternatives to the adversarial nature of courts. And mediation is a form of ADR, which uses a third party or mediator to facilitate negotiation between parties. And the mediator ensures this by making sure there's a common understanding of issues between parties, communicating parties' interests to one another, and then proposing solutions to address these interests. However, the outcome and process remain defined by the parties themselves, with the mediator's role really only to make sure that a fair outcome and process is followed. So why is mediation important to impact assessment? Well, as a form of ADR, it seeks to address some of the issues of quasi-judicial processes like impact assessment. These issues can include procedural justice concerns, at times adversarial natures, and as well as general power imbalances. And these issues can lead to a lot of conflicts in themselves, which requires some form of conflict management approach, which mediation can provide. Conflicts can also arise in impact assessment due to the differing interests and values we place on the environment and valued ecosystem components. And when these conflicts become complex, such as in the event of looking at trade-offs, there's a need for communication in order to ensure all interests are considered on a fair and equal basis. And by addressing conflict more equitably, mediation may also avoid cost and time overruns due to unaddressed conflict in the process. So as a result, mediation has the potential to address procedural justice, power, time, and efficiency concerns, which can often characterize IA processes. And so despite this potential, mediation has actually been fairly underused in impact assessment process in Canada. So there was an initial rise in the literature during the 80s and 90s, but that soon faded. And so the most recent article published on the subject was in 2010 by Dole and Sinclair. And so as a result, the current legislative and political context surrounding impact assessment has gone completely unaccounted for in our discussions of mediation today. And so despite a number of legal provisions within impact assessment legislation, as you can see on the slide, there's still been, again, that lack of practical application. And this may be due to the theoretical concerns with using mediation in the impact assessment process, such as concerns around transparency, lack of a legal basis in some jurisdictions, and as well as uncertain outcomes for the participants. And this uncertainty actually creates a pretty big feedback loop where the lack of use creates hesitancy and uncertainty around what the benefits and drawbacks could potentially be, and results again in lack of implementing that approach. So kind of creates the feedback loop there. But in order to address and understand what the concerns really are with mediation, we need to examine sort of the practical its practical applications in impact assessment cases in order to assess its strengths and weaknesses. And so to do that, I want to again share with you 3 case studies, which each use mediation in the context of impact assessment. And so the first formal use of mediation in IA was actually the construction of a small craft harbor. And so the Sandspit Harbor was a federal project and so required assessment under the environmental review process. And the parties to the assessment were the federal and provincial governments, as well as community groups on Haida Gwaii or Queen Charlotte Islands. And so the parties were able to identify their issues pretty early on as impacts to brant geese, impacts on fish habitat, and as well as the socioeconomic impacts of the project. And so they quickly agreed that mediation would be the best avenue to address these issues. And so they set ground rules with the help of a mediator and then met to mediate 15 times over a period of 14 months. Eventually reaching consensus on selecting the Hands Creek site to locate the harbor. So what worked in this case? Well, the parties established ground rules, which created an agreed upon process, which emphasized fairness, and this helped develop trust and the ability to negotiate effectively. Additionally, the specific implementation steps, which were outlined as part of the final agreement, also promoted accountability to the outcome and helped to implement it as well. But the Sandspit Harbor process has also been criticized, specifically for its timing overruns. So the participants to the mediation noted that the failure to identify information requirements at the beginning led to overruns by requiring the group to commission technical studies in the middle of their negotiation process in order to discuss the substantive issues in an effective way. The participants also became confused about the mediation process and were unsure of the role of other parties and the mediator, which created further setbacks. And these time overruns were actually linked to the higher than expected cost of the mediation, which was something that the participants noted. The Sandspit process has also been criticized for a lack of representation of all interests. Within the mediation group, only one of the permanent participants was female, and the Council of the Haida Nation and Old Masset Village Council only attended one of the 15 meetings, which may be indicative of the quality of the process to these groups. There was also a lack of a communication protocol between the mediation participants and their constituents, which resulted in inconsistent information sharing. And so the second case I want to share with you is the Rothsay rendering plan, which was a rendering plan developed by Maple Leaf Foods. And during the EA process, the St. Boniface Winnipeg community was concerned of the potential for sort of noxious odors emanating from this plant. And so in response, the Manitoba Clean Environment Commission, or the CEC, launched a set of exploratory meetings with citizens, the proponent, and government in order to determine an appropriate process for addressing these issues. And so the proponent and community soon agreed to engage in mediation, which would be facilitated by the CEC, and then eventually reached an agreement for a plant and equipment modification program, as well as a public information strategy to keep the public notified of the progress in meeting these implementations. And so by 2002, the proponent and community had agreed that the odor issue had been substantially solved and moved to dissolve the group. However, they continued their relationship using the information strategy to communicate with one another. And so I think the Rothsay case had two beneficial features. The first being that the mediator embraced its role as a facilitator, with the CEC intervening to help the parties agree on a process, which created a lot of buy-in into that process and eventually the success in reaching consensus and a resolution. And secondly, the use of a communication strategy was also beneficial as it helped to increase the transparency of the mediation while facilitating consensus and ongoing relationships. And so the third case I wanted to share with you today as well is actually a collection of cases from Rose and Suffling's 2001 paper. And they examined 6 land dispute cases between proponents and community groups, which had a significant environmental interest. And while these cases on their own are important to analyze, I'm not going to bore you by going into 6 land dispute cases. we will touch on them in just a moment. But the main importance of this paper was in establishing criteria for evaluating the outcomes of mediated agreements. And so the authors proposed two sets of criteria, one for process and one for outcome. And some of the process criteria that were outlined were if the mediator and the parties dealt with uncertainty in their discussions, discussed interests with one another, and ultimately reached a consensus. Whereas outcome criteria, some of those that were included were accounting for the long-term effects within proposed agreements, as well as meeting all interests as much as possible. And so out of the 6 cases they looked at, 5 were actually able to reach an environmentally sound decision according to these criteria, with 3 cases actually meeting 90% of all the criteria they stipulated. And so the authors identified that within these 6 cases, what made them the 5 of them successful was that they were characterized by an equal access to information, which allowed the parties to engage in a meaningful negotiation. On the flip side, though, unsuccessful cases were often defined by the opposite, an unequal access to information and knowledge, which created power imbalances between the proponents. Another factor that was noted in an unsuccessful mediation was physical distance between the parties as a factor in limiting the participants' ability to meet and discuss for negotiation. So what have we learned from these 3 cases? Well, I think importantly, they show that mediation can be successfully used in impact assessment. However, there still are some major concerns that need to be contended with. One of these is the intimate relationship between cost and time, as we saw in Sandspit, as well as the barriers of physical access, as well as access to information, resources, and education. Inclusionary access is also a big issue here, as well as understanding the role of communication for ensuring proper procedures are followed. And while these issues are complex in their own right, I think that the mediator can help to address these issues through embracing its role as a third party. This can include educating parties on the process to help clarify roles, as well as identifying issues, interests, and parties to that mediation earlier on in order to decrease time overruns, increase that equity, and lower the cost as a result. Setting ground rules with the parties on process elements such as communication and implementation is also another role that the mediator could take on. Additionally, there's also a need to develop criteria in order to evaluate mediated outcomes, in order to create a form of monitoring and oversight of these agreements, develop confidence in mediation and impact assessment, as well as identify areas for ongoing improvement. And so these lessons are useful for informing sort of a preliminary approach to mediation and impact assessment, with many of the identified issues here echoing principles outlined by the National Roundtable on the Environment and the Economy for reaching environmental consensus. And sort of notable overlaps here between the issues and the principles include the need for inclusivity, the need for self-design, access and respect for interests, as well as time management and implementation measures, and as well as underlying the voluntary nature to avoid sort of coercive mediation. And because of the ability of the NREE principles to address sort of a breadth of issues that we covered in these cases, there's a possibility then of using these principles to inform a set of consistent standards for mediation in order to promote data collection and learning and improving on mediation in IA. In terms of the process to arrive at these outcomes, we can also incorporate elements of strength that we noted from these cases. So for example, having a mediator embrace their role as a facilitator through identifying issues, interests, and education requirements, as well as setting ground rules with the parties for communication, implementation, structure, and time. And the mediator can also be a facilitator by clarifying roles to ensure parties negotiate on a mutually understood basis. And while these findings are useful, I think there are some additional factors that we need to consider. One of these is that while most of the cases I presented here and the general literature, most of these focus on Western mediation styles, and there's a lack of attention to Indigenous approaches and perspectives on the use of mediation in impact assessment. Additionally, in a participant-driven process like mediation, there's a need to consider how and if we can represent interests that have no effective representation, such as the physical environment and future generations. There's also a need to consider where mediation fits best within the impact assessment process. And this could be, for example, in scoping for identifying interests early on, the assessment itself for dealing with substantive issues, interests, and procedure, or in follow-up for creating agreements for monitoring and adaptive management. We've also seen that mediation can work best in the cases where, we've seen that mediation can work in these cases, which operate on a smaller scale. But I think we need to consider how and if mediation can be scaled to larger assessments. And so these areas of consideration are ones I hope to address through my research, and which I hope can also stimulate inquiry to evaluate the potential of mediation further in impact assessment. And so thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
That was so great. Thanks to our whole panel for adding to all of our consultation and engagement toolboxes today with some new tips and tricks. Happy to open up the microphone if anyone has any questions for our crew. I might ask one. This is more for Chris and John, but luckily I was on maternity leave during COVID. But you guys were just jumping into this project and having to relationship build with folks in a northern community during COVID, and you said, limited internet. So how did you manage that? Were there specific things that you guys tried to do or attempted? You changed your plans a little bit to adapt to COVID. Just wondering from my own personal interest how you managed that, because from my experience working with Indigenous communities particularly, it's always great to be in a room together and to start a relationship person to person. So COVID sort of changed how you might do something like that. So how did you guys manage that?
We actually had the benefit, and it's something that got cut out of our presentation, was that even though there was a changeover in proponents between 2010 and 2022, or 2020, the consultation lead and the main party of our proponents continued that consultation process. And so there's some continuity there, and actually that time period was really important for building that relationship, because it allowed them to really become more ingrained within the community and participate in community events. So examples we have from that is there's several ceremonies that occurred within the site, but even more important is our proponent became a regular attendee at community events. So whether it be through their annual moose hunt or some of the educational and outreach programs to share traditional knowledge between elders and youth, they got to be present. So they really became part of that community. And so when we talk about COVID, it was the formal context that was the challenge. It was the challenge of getting the formal regulatory requirements for the JRP. That was the challenge with COVID, is a lot of those relationships had already been set. Fully acknowledging that there were challenges throughout that process as far as it relates to as I know you appreciate doing an EIS addendum and then getting input through that virtually is a challenge in itself. But they had a great relationship when we came there.
Yeah, maybe just the only thing I'll add to that is really I think a lot of it fell on the agency in terms of the logistics around trying to hold a hearing in the middle of COVID, right? Ideally, it's face-to-face and in-person consultation. So the way they managed that was to essentially host a hearing entirely online using Teams and Zoom technology, and the hearing itself was anyone could watch it on YouTube live. And so some of those that technology was used and implemented because we weren't able to get together. There was a session near the end that EN hosted in their community, and I think the only participant that wasn't from the community was a CCT member who was there and in the community, but in a separate building. So it was definitely a unique opportunity with lots of hurdles to overcome.
Good job. Eve, go ahead.
I don't know, I think we're good. John, this is specifically for you. You mentioned a little bit about community monitoring, and community monitoring, I don't know why that's a hard word to say right now, has always made so much sense to me, because I feel like who knows like the local landscape better than the people who have been living there. I was wondering if you could just elaborate a little bit on that. Was that like wanted by the community or by the proponent, or was that something you guys kind of brought together, and what did it look like? Briefly, I guess.
It's something that's still in the ropes.
Okay.
It's certainly coming through now. When we sort of were referencing that, there was a strong interest from the community and their support network to be involved with that. Then there's, and I think Paul sort of alluded to this, there's sort of the regulatory and compliance monitoring that's going to have to occur by a proponent. So, for example, if we're getting an ECA on air, we're going to have to meet the requirements for monitoring on that. But there's interest by the community, and the proponent in this case was interested in helping support the community in developing those programs. So whether or not it'd be around interests to water or fish or to other Indigenous uses of the land, that's sort of what they were looking at. The meat and potatoes of that is in the works.
Thank you.
That's an online question, share.
It's more a comment, and I don't know if it's something that the fellows from Stantec can address, but somebody just suggested it would be nice to hear directly from Bigtagong Nishnabeg today. Was there any conversation or effort to try and include someone from the community in this conversation?
I agree. Right? I think it'd be great to hear from the community. No one's here today to speak to it. Only they can speak on their behalf. I know that the proponent, Gen PGM, and EN and other communities in the area continue those conversations. And as we go through the process and get to actually implementing some of these conditions, consultation and engagement, we'll obviously have to continue. I'm sure that they would have a lot to offer in terms of how this overall process, right? The process of engaging with First Nations is definitely more than just proponent and the First Nation communities themselves, right? It's the whole EA process, right? The PIS is just a component. The proponent's just one actor in this larger process, right? And having agency engagement, a dedicated CCT team that integrates into the community and talks to them and understands their needs, their issues, and facilitates that communication both with the proponent and to other agencies that may have control over addressing some of those concerns, all kind of factor into that success of the overall EA process and facilitating that consultation.
Thank you. And I just to follow up to Eve's question, I mean, maybe one thing to consider, particularly in these large mining projects with multiple communities, is is a guardians program as an approach to monitoring. And again, there's federal funding associated with that, but that might be an obvious way to sort of support community conversations about monitoring. So, thanks.
Anyone have anything else they want to share or ask?
Clock's coming up.
Hi, I got a mediation question. Really interesting. Do you have any information on other jurisdictions that might be using mediation as a method in impact assessment or EA? And also, I was wondering if you have any ideas why federally we used to have mediation and don't have that anymore, and provincially there was mediation. I don't know if you got any ideas why you think that people have been straying away from mediation.
Thanks. Yeah, I don't know what other jurisdictions have legislative provisions for mediation. I know that outlined in the slides, Manitoba, Ontario, and Quebec are ones that have it in their legislation currently. I'm not sure if BC does or does not. Sorry, I'm just trying to remember the other part of your question. Sorry, I have a bad memory.
It's all right, it's the last day too, and we've been waiting. I was just wondering about the other jurisdictions. I was thinking worldwide, but that's okay. You don't have to go into that much detail. But also, do you have any ideas why you think that maybe some of these jurisdictions aren't using it as a tool for impact assessment?
Yeah, thanks again for repeating. I think it is interesting, and something I noted as well was that, as I had on this slide, mediation provisions exist in SIA 1995, but they don't exist in the Impact Assessment Act currently, which is interesting, and I'm not sure why it was removed, but I think, again, it might be because it was so underused that people kind of, as I mentioned, that kind of hesitancy toward, if this hasn't been applied, if it's not been used, maybe people don't want to use it or are unsure of how a mediated impact assessment is going to benefit them or impact them. So that would be I think generally that would be what I would guess is why they're not used that much, and applying that to other jurisdictions. But it's definitely something to look into as well.
Last call? Okay. Maybe I'll invite Cheryl up to, obviously. Let's give them a big round of applause for sharing all their great findings today. And Cheryl, whenever you're ready, you can close us up.
So I'm sorry that Marianne wasn't able to present. She would have been the third partner on this presentation today, but it does mean that I get to wrap up some comments and you get to go home early. Yay. Okay. So yes, closing remarks. I just want to say thank you very much again to everybody. We had 95 people registered to be here in person, which kind of exceeded our expectations. And at least 56 people have joined us virtually. And fortunately, we've been able to help people who didn't feel well or changed their mind, and they've managed to switch virtually as well. So I'm pleased that we've been able to accommodate that. Today, we've heard from First Nations, we've heard from students, and we've heard from consultants and the government. We've seen case studies, we've learned about some research, and we've heard from both Indigenous and federal governments in their approaches to IA and how things are going. I want to give some thanks to our students and our participating organizations who joined us to do this very informal and hopefully fun and interesting networking session. I think we need to find ways to get more students here so that we're not poaching from each other as we go forward. The note on the slide is to remind me that we are, Simon, and I don't know if Haley Austin is there, two students that have been helping us over the year think about our work with students and research education institutions. And I'm pleased to say that they're going to be helping us lead the development of a podcast. And probably everybody in this program at one point or another might be asked to come and talk to us about something interesting and thoughtful about IA. And they will be part of this. This is Impact Assessment podcast, which we're going to put together as a student subcommittee as well. So thank you to Simon and Haley for helping us get this started and thinking about it, and stay tuned. I also want to thank the planning committee, the OAIA board, Sue Billick, the folks here at York who've been really helpful, Yulia, Juan, and Jacob in the back, Christina, the lady that's been managing most of your dinners and cookies and coffee today at York University. This was a big shift for us and someone very different in terms of OAI conferences, so I'm pleased that it worked well, and looking for your feedback as well on that. I want to thank Blue Moth, who are our creative team with the website and help put together the program and the posters that you see outside. And Alex in the back there, thank you so much at Webcast. Guru, as well as Andrew, who's somewhere in the ether, who's helped us bring this together and make it work, because I can't do that. And again, thanks to our sponsors and of course you for attending, both in person and online. I wanted to remind you that there's some of us signed up for a field trip tomorrow. This is the map that's on the website. It's also part of the field event emails that you would have received from Sue. If you're not sure if you're registered and you want to be, please do go see Sue and or myself after the meeting, or after we finish here. And the map, we're looking at the flag with Black Creek Pioneer Village there. If you could meet us in the parking lot at Black Creek Pioneer Village by about 9 a.m., that would be great. And then we'll carry on together. You'll need some PPE if you're going to join us on the construction site, but there's also a boxed lunch, and it looks like a lot of fun in terms of an interactive session later in the afternoon. We didn't discuss this yesterday, but we want to hear from you. And if this doesn't make sense to you, just writing this down right now, it will be coming to you in an email, but we've got online evaluation forms for both our virtual attendees as well as our in-person attendees. And again, we really do use this information to help for planning next year and for future events as well. And I'll just put a plug in for folks that may be interested in joining OAIA more formally. We're having an annual general meeting on the 17th of November. It's virtual. It's at 5 o'clock in the evening, so it's after your workday. It's open to all OAIA members in good standing, and we are always looking for not just directors on the board to do the work, but also some committee chairs, and we'd like, if you're interested, you to be part of that planning process for next year. And that email notice has gone out to any of the current OAI members, but if you want and are interested and need it and don't know whether you've received it or not, please do get in touch with info@oaia.on.ca, and we'll send you that link. And that's it for me. Thank you very much. Please travel safe. Have a good weekend. And again, thank you so much for coming and presenting, being part of this conversation. And yeah, don't get COVID, stay safe. Bye, everyone. Thank you.